A Navy SEAL vanished without a storm, without a trace, just one quiet decision to leave. For 6 years, his dog kept returning to the same door, as if something was never finished. No one knew whether it was loyalty or something deeper that refused to let go. Then one day, a stranger arrived, carrying a past he could no longer outrun. What he found wasn't a mystery to solve, but a choice he could no longer avoid. Because sometimes the hardest thing isn't losing someone, it's deciding whether to stay. If this story speaks to you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Cannon Beach, Oregon, did not wake up all at once. It unfolded. Light first, thin and pale, slipping between the tall silhouettes of spruce trees. Then came the sound of waves, steady and unhurried, like a breath the ocean had been holding all night. Gulls followed, their cries sharp enough to break the quiet, but never loud enough to disturb it. Everything in the town seemed to know where it belonged. The boats rocked gently in their slips. The bakery on Hemlock Street lit its ovens before sunrise. Even the wind had its patterns, turning inland just as the day grew warm, carrying the scent of salt and kelp through narrow streets lined with weathered wood and faded paint. Nothing rushed. Nothing needed to. Except, perhaps, one creature who never quite moved with the rest of the world. Atlas did not greet the morning. He watched it. The German shepherd lay stretched along the narrow porch of a small white house at the edge of town, his body angled toward the front door, though his eyes were already open long before the sun touched the horizon. He was not asleep when the night ended. He simply stopped waiting for it. Up close, Atlas carried time in his body the way old trees carried wind, etched, quiet, undeniable. His coat was the classic black and tan of his breed, but the black had spread wider over the years, darkening his back and shoulders until it looked less like fur and more like a shadow draped across him. The tan along his chest and legs had dulled, softened by years of salt air and sun. One ear stood straight. The other bent slightly at the tip, a permanent fold that gave him a look of unfinished attention, as if he were always listening, but not entirely convinced by what he heard. There was a scar near his left eye, small, pale. Easy to miss unless you knew where to look. No one in town remembered when he got it. Atlas rose slowly when the light reached the porch, not with stiffness, but with deliberation. He stretched once, front legs extended, back arched, and then stepped down onto the wooden boards with a quiet certainty. He did not bark, he did not wander. He turned as he always did and looked at the door. It was a simple door, white paint slightly chipped near the handle, a brass knob dulled by years of use. There was nothing remarkable about it, except that it had not opened from the inside in 6 years. The first time people noticed the dog, they thought it was a phase. A grieving animal, they said, it would pass. Dogs moved on. That was what they did. They adjusted. They found new rhythms, new attachments they forgot. But Atlas did not forget. He adapted. And that, somehow, unsettled people more. By mid-morning, the town moved as it always did. Fishermen hauled nets. Tourists wandered the shoreline, pausing to photograph Haystack Rock as if it might disappear if they didn't capture it quickly enough. Children, visiting, not local, ran too close to the water and were called back by voices that carried both laughter and warning. Atlas remained near the house. He moved only when necessary, when the sun grew too strong and forced him into the shade, or when the wind shifted and carried something unfamiliar through the air. He did not follow people. He did not seek them out. But he was never entirely alone. Across the narrow gravel path, separated by a low fence softened with climbing ivy, stood another house, older, slightly leaning. its windows framed with lace curtains that had yellowed with time. That was where Mrs. Darlene Whitaker lived. She had lived there longer than most people could remember. Long enough that the town had changed around her, while she remained exactly where she was, like a fixed point in a drifting map. Darlene was small, barely reaching 5'3", but there was a steadiness in the way she moved that made her seem taller. Her white hair was always pulled back into a loose bun, and her hands, though lined with age, never trembled when they worked. She noticed things, not in the way people watched for gossip or curiosity. She noticed the spaces between actions, the pauses, the absences. That was why she never called Atlas the dog who waits. She knew better. Just before noon, she stepped out onto her porch with a small metal bowl in her hand. "Morning, Atlas," she said, her voice carrying easily across the yard. Atlas did not turn immediately. He finished what he was doing, standing still, facing the door, before shifting his head slightly in her direction. It wasn't acknowledgement. Not quite. More like acceptance. Darlene crossed the short distance between their homes without hesitation, her shoes pressing softly into the gravel. She set the bowl down near the edge of the porch, not too close, not too far. She had learned the distance over time. "Chicken today," she added, as if explanation mattered. Atlas stepped forward after she moved back. He ate slowly. Not because he was cautious, but because he was not hungry in the way other dogs were. Food was something he accepted, not something he sought. Darlene watched him for a moment, then turned her gaze to the door. "You still think he's coming back," she murmured. It wasn't a question. Atlas didn't respond, but something shifted, not in his body but in the air around him. A quiet tension, like a string pulled just tight enough to hum. Darlene sighed softly. "No," she corrected herself. "That's not it, is it?" She folded her arms, studying the dog with the same patient attention she gave everything else. "You're not waiting for him," she said after a while. "You're waiting for something he left behind." Atlas stopped eating. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just paused. His head lifted a fraction, ears adjusting to a sound that hadn't yet reached human ears. Darlene noticed. She always did. "What is it?" she asked, her voice lowering without thinking. The wind shifted. It came in from the ocean, sharper now, carrying with it the faint, distant hum of an engine, low, uneven, the kind that belonged to an older boat pushing against the tide. Atlas turned. Not toward the street. Not toward Darlene. Toward the horizon, though the ocean itself was hidden behind rows of houses and trees. His body stilled completely. Every line of him sharpened, focused, as if something deep inside had just been called, not loudly, not urgently, but unmistakably. Darlene followed his gaze, though she could see nothing. The sound faded. The wind softened. And just like that, whatever had reached him passed. Atlas lowered his head again, finished eating, and stepped back to the same spot he had stood before, facing the door. The town would remember that moment differently, if it remembered it at all. To most, it was just another day, another shift in the wind, another sound lost to distance. But for Darlene, something had changed, not in the world, in the pattern. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent and the sky turned the color of fading embers, Atlas moved again. Not immediately, not when the light first softened. He waited. For what, no one could say. Then, as the wind turned, subtle, almost imperceptible, he stepped down from the porch and walked to the front of the door. He did not sit right away. He stood there for a long moment, head slightly lowered, as if listening not to the outside world, but to something within the quiet of the house itself. The street was nearly empty. A passing car slowed just enough for the driver to glance over. A couple walking hand in hand paused, their conversation drifting into silence as they watched. They had seen this before, but something about it still held them. Atlas sat, not heavily, not wearily, with intention. His posture was straight, balanced, the way he might have once sat beside a man giving commands, alert, ready, but not expecting movement. The door did not open. It never did. Inside, the house remained still, holding its silence like a breath that had gone on too long. Across the way, Darlene stood in her window, the curtain pulled slightly aside. She did not call out, did not interfere. Some things she understood were not meant to be interrupted. The sky darkened. The sound of the ocean grew louder as the town quieted. Lights flickered on in neighboring homes, one by one, until the street was lined with soft, golden squares of warmth. Atlas did not move. Time passed around him. Not through him. At some point, the couple who had paused earlier continued on their way. The car that had slowed returned, headlights briefly illuminating the dog's still figure before disappearing down the road. Darlene remained at her window longer than usual, watching, not the dog. But the space between him and the door, there was something there, not visible, not tangible, but present. A question that had never been answered. A promise that had never been completed. Finally, she let the curtain fall back into place. Not waiting, she whispered to the empty room. Guarding. Outside, Atlas remained where he was. The night settled fully now, wrapping the town in its familiar quiet. The wind softened again, carrying only the steady rhythm of waves against the shore. And there, in front of a door that had not opened in 6 years, a dog kept his place. Not as a prisoner of memory, not as a creature lost in hope, but as something older than both. A witness. Marcus Hale did not arrive in Cannon Beach with purpose. He arrived because he had run out of places that didn't feel like endings. The bus dropped him off just past noon, its engine coughing once before pulling away in a cloud of dust and diesel. The driver didn't ask if he'd be staying long. People like Marcus rarely answered that question honestly anyway. He stood for a moment on the side of the road, one hand gripping the strap of a worn duffel bag slung across his shoulder. The wind came in from the ocean, cooler than he expected, carrying salt and something metallic beneath it, like rust or old anchors left too long in the tide. He took a breath, held it, let it go slowly. The town stretched out in front of him, quiet but not empty. A few cars passed. A couple walked by with coffee cups and no urgency. Somewhere, a screen door creaked open and shut. Nothing demanded his attention. Nothing asked him to stay. Marcus adjusted the strap on his shoulder and started walking. He moved like someone trained not to waste steps. Even now, years removed from the structure that had once defined him, his body remembered things his mind preferred not to revisit. His shoulders stayed level. His gaze moved in short, deliberate sweeps. Not searching, not scanning, just aware. 45 years old, 6 feet tall, still strong, though not in the way men tried to prove. The strength was quieter now, settled into muscle that had learned endurance instead of speed. His green t-shirt clung lightly to his back where the sun had warmed it. Black jeans, worn but clean. Boots that had seen more ground than most people ever would. A watch sat on his wrist. He didn't check it. Time, for Marcus, had stopped being something to measure a long time ago. He found the harbor without trying. It was where the wind led him. Rows of boats lined the docks, their hulls rocking gently against ropes that had been tied and retied 1,000 times. Nets hung drying. Gulls circled overhead, waiting for something careless to fall. Marcus stepped onto the wooden planks and paused. For a second, just a second, the sound of the water shifting beneath him blurred into something else. Helicopter blades, radio static, a voice cutting through noise. He blinked. The harbor returned, still, predictable, safe. He exhaled through his nose and kept walking. Looking for work? The voice came from his left. Marcus turned slightly. The man standing there wasn't trying to be imposing, but there was something solid about him, like a structure that had been standing long enough to stop worrying about storms. Caleb Turner, late 50s, broad shoulders that had softened but not weakened. A denim shirt rolled up at the sleeves, exposing forearms marked with old scars and fresh grease. His beard had gone mostly gray, though it hadn't lost its thickness. A cap sat low on his head, shading eyes that didn't miss much. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Caleb didn't push. He just waited, chewing slowly on a piece of gum, as if silence were part of the conversation. "Maybe," Marcus said finally. Caleb nodded once, like that was enough. "Can you fix things?" Marcus glanced past him at a boat propped up on wooden supports, its side panel partially removed. "Depends what's broken." Caleb's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough. That's usually the right answer. He jerked his thumb toward the boat. "Come by tomorrow morning, 7, if you're still here." "Not if you want the job. If you're still here." Marcus caught that. He gave a short nod. Caleb didn't ask his name. Marcus didn't offer it. Somewhere between them, something had already been understood. By late afternoon, Marcus had found a place to stay. A small room above a convenience store that smelled faintly of coffee and cardboard. The kind of place that didn't ask for references, didn't expect permanence. He dropped his bag on the floor, sat on the edge of the bed. The silence settled in around him, thicker now without the noise of movement. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands hanging loosely between them. For a long time, he didn't move. Then, without meaning to, his mind drifted. Ethan's back. That's what he always saw, not his face, not the moment. Just the back of him, walking away. There had been darkness, but not the kind that came from night. Something heavier, something that swallowed sound. Ethan, the name never finished. It never did. Marcus shut his eyes. Pressed his thumb into the bridge of his nose. "Not here," he muttered under his breath. But it was always here. He left the room before the walls could close in. The town had shifted into evening by then, the light softer, stretched thin across rooftops and the distant line of the ocean. People moved slower. Conversations lingered. Marcus walked without direction. Not aimlessly, just without choosing. And somehow, without realizing it, his steps brought him to the edge of a quieter street. A white house stood there, simple, weathered, still. He might have passed it, probably would have. Except something, small, almost nothing, made him stop. A presence, not loud, not urgent, just there. The dog stood near the front door. Marcus didn't know its name yet, didn't know its history. But he knew dogs. And this one didn't behave like the others he'd seen along the way. It didn't bark when he approached, didn't shift its weight or step forward. It simply stood there, watching. The wind moved through its coat, lifting the black along its back like a shadow that refused to settle. One ear stood straight. The other dipped slightly, catching the light in an uneven line. There was a scar near its eye, old, faded, the kind that didn't need explanation. Marcus stopped a few feet away, not too close, not too far. Something about the dog's stillness demanded that distance. For a moment, neither of them moved. The town breathed quietly behind him. A door shut somewhere down the street. A car passed, slow enough not to disturb anything. The dog's eyes held his. Amber, steady, not curious, not cautious, assessing. Marcus felt it before he understood it, that look. He had seen it before, not in animals, in men. The kind of look that didn't ask, "Who are you?" It asked, "What kind of man are you when no one's watching?" Marcus shifted his weight slightly. The movement was small, almost imperceptible. The dog didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't blink. It just waited. And for the first time in longer than Marcus could remember, something inside him hesitated, not from fear, from recognition. There were moments in life that didn't belong to time. They didn't pass. They stayed, stretched thin between what had been and what hadn't happened yet. This was one of them. Marcus could have turned around, walked away. It would have been easy. He had done it before, many times, but his feet didn't move, not forward, not back, just stayed. The dog took a single step, not toward him, not away, just enough to shift its stance to ground itself more firmly in place. Marcus exhaled, slow, controlled. "Yeah," he murmured, though he wasn't sure why. The word wasn't for the dog. It wasn't even for himself. It was an answer to something that hadn't been spoken. A curtain moved in the window across the street. An older woman stood there watching, not with suspicion, but with a kind of quiet attention that came from years of seeing things unfold slowly. She didn't interrupt, didn't call out, just observed. Marcus felt her presence but didn't turn. This moment didn't belong to anyone else. The wind shifted again, carrying the distant sound of waves. The dog's ear twitched, just slightly. Then it stilled. And just like that, whatever had passed between them, whatever question had been asked, settled into something quieter, not resolved, not answered, just acknowledged. Marcus nodded once, a habit, a reflex. Then he stepped back, not in retreat, in understanding. The dog didn't follow, didn't need to. It had already decided something. Marcus could feel it, even without knowing what it was. As he turned and walked away, the weight in his chest didn't lift. It shifted, like something that had been waiting, not for him exactly, but for someone like him to pass through. Behind him, the dog returned its attention to the door, the same position, as if nothing had changed, and yet, Marcus knew better. Somewhere between the silence, the distance, and that unwavering gaze, a question had been placed in his path. One he hadn't answered. Not yet. That night, back in his small room, Marcus sat on the edge of the bed again, the same position, the same stillness. But this time, when he closed his eyes, it wasn't Ethan walking away that he saw. It was a dog standing in front of a door, waiting, not for someone to come back, but for someone to decide whether they would leave or stay. The box was smaller than Marcus expected. It sat on Mrs. Darlene Whittaker's kitchen table like something that had already made its decision about being opened. No tape, no lock, just a simple wooden lid, worn smooth at the edges from years of being handled and then, eventually, not handled at all. Darlene didn't push it toward him. She didn't need to. Marcus stood on the other side of the table, one hand resting against the back of a chair he hadn't yet pulled out. The room smelled faintly of chamomile tea and old wood, the kind of scent that came from a place that had outlived several versions of itself. "You don't have to," she said, not looking at him directly. Her voice was soft, but not fragile. It carried the weight of someone who had learned when to speak and when to let silence do its work. Marcus let out a quiet breath. I know. But he didn't move away. That was the problem. He rarely did. Darlene finally glanced at him, her pale blue eyes studying his face with a kind of quiet patience. You knew him, she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded once. Long time ago. She considered that, then gave a small hum, as if filing the answer somewhere among 1,000 others she had never written down. He wasn't good at staying still, she said after a moment. Even when he wasn't going anywhere. Marcus pulled out the chair and sat. The wood creaked under his weight. Sounds about right. Darlene reached for her teacup, lifting it carefully with both hands. He left this with me, she said, nodding toward the box. Didn't say why, just said, if anyone came asking, I'd know whether to give it to them. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. And you decided I'm that someone? Darlene sipped her tea before answering. No, she said simply. I decided you're someone who won't run from what's inside. That landed differently, not heavier, just more accurately. Marcus rested both hands on the table. For a long moment he didn't touch the box, he just looked at it. Wood grain worn thin in places, a small scratch near the corner. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that suggested it held anything worth hesitating over. And yet, his fingers curled slightly against the surface of the table, as if preparing for impact. You read them? He asked. Darlene shook her head. Some things aren't meant to be understood by the wrong person. And I'm the right one? She met his gaze then, steady and unflinching. You're the one who came back. Marcus didn't respond, because that wasn't entirely true. He hadn't come back. He had just arrived. The lid lifted with a soft, dry sound. Inside, the letters were stacked neatly, tied together with a thin piece of twine that had yellowed with age. The envelopes were unsealed. Some were creased. Others still held the shape of being folded and unfolded too many times. Marcus reached in, paused, then pulled the bundle free. The first letter felt lighter than it should have. He untied the twine slowly, as if the act itself required permission. Darlene stood. I'll give you some space, she said, already turning toward the sink. Marcus didn't thank her. She didn't expect him to. The paper was rough beneath his fingers. Not old enough to crumble, but old enough to carry time in its texture. He unfolded the first letter. No date, no address, just a name at the top. Atlas. Marcus frowned slightly. He read, You don't ask questions. That's what I like about you. You sit, you watch, you wait. I don't know if that's loyalty or just patience. Maybe there's no difference. Marcus's brow tightened. He turned the page. Some nights I think about leaving. Not far, not forever. Just enough to see if the noise in my head follows me or stays behind. But then you're there, at the door, like you already know I won't come back the same. Marcus swallowed. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. They felt close. Too close. He reached for another letter. This one was shorter. I tried to explain it once. Didn't go well. People want things to make sense. War doesn't leave room for that. It just rearranges what makes sense until nothing fits anymore. Marcus let out a quiet breath through his nose. His thumb pressed into the edge of the paper, holding it just a little too tightly. Another letter. You deserve someone who doesn't disappear halfway through a promise. I don't know if I'm that man. That line stayed. Not on the page, in him. Marcus leaned back slightly in the chair, the wood creaking again under the shift in weight. For a moment, he didn't reach for the next letter. He just sat there, staring at the one in his hand, as if it might change if he looked long enough. It didn't. "You okay?" Darlene's voice came from behind him, gentle but grounded. Marcus didn't turn. "Yeah?" A pause. "No." He let out a breath, longer this time. "He wrote these to the dog." Darlene moved closer, stopping just behind his shoulder. "He talked to that dog more than he talked to people," she said. Marcus gave a faint, humorless exhale. "Yeah, I get that." He flipped through the remaining letters, not reading each one fully now, but catching fragments. Phrases, half-thoughts, pieces of something that had never been finished. Sleepless nights. Silence that pressed too hard. The sense of being out of place in a life that should have felt familiar. Nothing about missions, nothing about enemies. Just aftermath. "You ever notice," Marcus said quietly, "how it's not the things you remember that mess you up?" Darlene didn't answer right away. She waited. "It's the things you don't," he continued. "The gaps, the parts that don't line up." Darlene set her cup down on the counter. "Memory isn't built to be complete," she said. "It's built to protect." Marcus gave a slight shake of his head. "Doesn't feel like it." "No," she agreed softly. "It rarely does." Later that afternoon, Marcus found himself standing outside a small building near the edge of town. A simple sign hung above the door. Grady Veterinary Clinic. He didn't remember deciding to come here, but his feet had brought him anyway. Inside, the space smelled faintly of antiseptic and cedar. A man stood behind the counter, flipping through a clipboard with the kind of focus that came from routine rather than urgency. Dr. Simon Grady, mid-60s maybe. Thin, slightly stooped at the shoulders, but not fragile. His hair was a soft gray, falling loosely around his temples. His hands moved with precision, steady, practiced, the kind of hands that had done the same work for decades without losing care. He looked up as the door closed. "Help you with something?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded once. "The dog," he said. Grady tilted his head slightly. "Which one?" "The one by the White House on Alder Street." Recognition flickered. "Atlas." Marcus nodded. "Yeah." Grady set the clipboard down. "Something wrong with him?" "No." Marcus shifted his weight. "I just wanted to ask." Grady studied him for a moment, then gestured toward a chair. "Go ahead." Marcus didn't sit. "He's been there a long time," he said. Grady nodded slowly. "Longer than he should have been." Marcus frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Grady leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms loosely. "First year after Ethan disappeared, that dog barely ate," he said. "Wouldn't leave the porch, wouldn't sleep properly, heart rate always elevated." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. "He was waiting," he said. Grady shook his head. "No," he said gently. "He was breaking." That landed harder than anything in the letters. "What changed?" Marcus asked. Grady's gaze drifted slightly, as if looking at something beyond the walls of the clinic. "Time," he said, "and something else." Marcus waited. Grady glanced back at him. He stopped expecting. Silence settled between them. "He still goes to the door," Marcus said. "Yeah," Grady agreed, "but not the same way." Marcus frowned. Grady's voice softened. "There's a difference between waiting for someone to come back," he said, "and staying because you've already decided they won't." Marcus didn't have an answer for that. He nodded once, turned, and left. That evening, the letters sat open on the small table in his room. Marcus stood by the window, looking out at nothing in particular. The light had faded. The town had quieted. Somewhere in the distance, the ocean moved in its endless rhythm. He didn't pick up the letters again, didn't need to. One line had already done its work. "You deserve someone who doesn't disappear halfway through a promise." Marcus closed his eyes. For a moment, the image came back. Ethan, walking away, not turning, not stopping. But this time, something else stood in that space. Not a memory, a question. Marcus opened his eyes, and for the first time since arriving, he didn't feel like leaving. The harbor looked different in the early morning. Not quieter, just more honest. There were fewer voices to soften the edges of things. No tourists yet, no idle conversations drifting across the docks. Just the low creak of ropes, the dull knock of wood against wood, and the steady pull of the tide beneath it all. Marcus arrived before Caleb. He didn't plan to, he just woke up before the day had fully decided what it was going to be. The air was colder than usual, carrying a sharper bite from the ocean. He stood near the edge of the dock, hands resting loosely at his sides, watching the water move in slow, deliberate patterns. He didn't think about the letters, not directly, but they hadn't left him either. Some things didn't need to be remembered to stay. "You're early." Caleb's voice came from behind him, thick with sleep but steady. Marcus turned slightly. Caleb walked toward him with a thermos in one hand, his boots heavy against the wood. He looked the same as yesterday, denim shirt, worn cap, but there was something more alert in his eyes this morning. Like he had already decided something about Marcus. "Couldn't sleep," Marcus said. Caleb nodded, as if that explained everything. "Most people who end up here can't," he replied. He stopped beside Marcus, unscrewed the thermos, and took a slow sip. "Coffee," he offered, without looking at him. Marcus shook his head. "I'm good." Caleb didn't insist. He never seemed like the kind of man who needed people to agree with him. They worked without much conversation. The boat, Caleb had pointed out the day before, needed more than a simple fix. The engine housing had corroded in places, bolts stuck in stubborn positions that refused to yield without effort. Marcus handled the tools like he had handled everything else. Efficient, quiet, focused. Not rushed, not distracted, just present. Caleb noticed. He always did. "You ever work on engines before?" he asked at one point, watching Marcus loosen a rusted joint without forcing it. Marcus shrugged slightly. "Enough." Caleb huffed a quiet laugh. "That's another answer that usually means more than it says." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. By midday, the sun had burned through the early haze, leaving the harbor brighter, louder, more alive. Caleb wiped his hands on a rag and leaned back against the boat. "There's someone you should talk to," he said, almost casually. Marcus glanced up. "About?" Caleb tilted his head toward the far end of the docks. "Old Ben." Marcus followed his gaze. At the edge of the harbor, slightly removed from the others, sat a smaller fishing boat. Older, its paint faded unevenly by years of sun and salt. A man stood beside it, bent slightly at the waist as he worked on a net. Even from a distance, there was something deliberate in the way he moved. Not slow, not weak, just measured. "He's been here longer than the rest of us," Caleb continued. "Sees things most people miss." Marcus narrowed his eyes slightly. "And?" Caleb shrugged. "You're asking questions," he said. "Figured you might want answers that don't come from paper." Marcus wiped his hands on his jeans. For a moment he hesitated. Not out of doubt, out of recognition. This was the part where things changed, where quiet observation turned into something else, something with direction. Old Ben Carter didn't look up when Marcus approached. He kept working the net through his hands, fingers moving with a practiced rhythm that didn't break just because someone new had stepped into his space. Marcus stopped a few feet away, didn't speak, waited. It wasn't a test, just respect. After a moment, Ben spoke. "You're not from here." His voice was rough, worn by years of wind and salt, but steady. "No," Marcus said. Ben nodded slightly, still not looking up. "Figured." Another pause. Then Marcus said it. "I'm looking for Ethan Cole." That made Ben stop, not abruptly, just enough for the rhythm in his hands to break. Slowly, he straightened, turning just enough to face Marcus. His face was older than Marcus expected, not just in years, but in the way time had settled into it. Deep lines carved by sun and long days, eyes the color of storm water, sharp despite their age. "You're late," Ben said. Marcus held his gaze. "I know." Ben studied him for a moment longer. Then he nodded toward the edge of the dock. "Walk." They moved in silence at first. The boards creaked under their weight, the water shifting below them in quiet response. Ben stopped near the end, resting one hand on the railing. "He didn't get lost," Ben said. Marcus didn't react. "I figured." Ben glanced at him. "Most people don't," he said. "They like the idea better. Makes things easier to explain." Marcus leaned slightly against the railing, arms loose at his sides. "So, what happened?" Ben looked out toward the horizon. The line where water met sky was faint today, blurred by distance and light. "No storm," he said. "No engine trouble. I was out there myself that evening, saw him leave." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. "Alone?" Ben nodded. "Same boat he always used. Didn't rush, didn't hesitate." He paused. "Didn't look back." The words settled heavily between them. Not dramatic, not loud, just final. "He knew what he was doing," Ben continued. Marcus exhaled slowly. "You sound sure." Ben let out a low breath, almost a chuckle. "You don't spend 40 years on the water without learning the difference between a man who's lost," he said, "and a man who's decided." Marcus looked down at the water. The tide had shifted slightly, pulling outward now. "What kind of man decides that?" he asked. Ben didn't answer right away. He watched the horizon a little longer, then, "The kind who thinks leaving is the last thing he can still control." That hit harder than Marcus expected. Not because it was surprising, because it wasn't. Ben turned his head slightly, studying Marcus again. "You knew him?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah." Ben's eyes narrowed just a fraction. "Then you know he wasn't running from something out there," he said, gesturing toward the open water. "He was running from something he couldn't put down." Marcus didn't respond, because there wasn't anything to say. They stood there for a while after that, not talking, just letting the truth sit where it had been placed. When Marcus finally walked back toward the main dock, the harbor felt different again. Not heavier, just clearer. Like a question had been replaced by something less forgiving. He didn't notice the sheriff at first, but the sheriff noticed him. Sheriff Nolan Pierce stood near the entrance to the docks, hands resting on his belt, posture relaxed, but not careless. He had the look of someone who didn't waste attention. Tall, straight-backed. His uniform sat clean and precise against him, every line in place without needing adjustment. Sunglasses hid his eyes but not his focus. Marcus felt it before he saw it. That shift, that weight. He turned, their gazes met, or would have if Marcus could see past the reflection in the lenses. Nolan stepped forward, not quickly, not slowly. Just enough to close the distance without making it feel like a move. "You're new," he said. Marcus nodded once. "Passing through." Nolan tilted his head slightly. "People who pass through don't usually stay long enough to start asking questions." Marcus didn't look away. "What kind of questions?" Nolan's mouth twitched slightly, not quite a smile. "The kind that lead to old names," he said. "Old stories." A pause. "Ethan Cole." Marcus didn't react outwardly, but something in his shoulders tightened. Nolan caught it. He always did. "Town like this," Nolan continued, "we notice when someone starts digging into things that have already been settled." Marcus let out a quiet breath. "I'm not digging." Nolan studied him. "Then what are you doing?" There it was. Not a threat, not yet, just a line. Marcus held his ground. For a moment he considered giving the easy answer, passing through. "Just curious. Doesn't mean anything." But the words didn't come. Not because he couldn't say them, because they wouldn't stay true. "I knew him," Marcus said instead. Nolan's head tilted slightly. "That so?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah?" Silence stretched between them. The harbor moved around them, voices, footsteps, the low hum of engines, but none of it reached where they stood. Nolan finally spoke again. "People come here sometimes," he said, "looking for something they think got left behind." Marcus didn't answer. "They don't usually find it," Nolan added. Marcus met his gaze, or where he imagined it was behind the dark lenses. Maybe they're looking in the wrong place. That was enough. For now. Nolan stepped back slightly, giving Marcus space, but not trust, not yet. "Maybe," he said. Then he turned, walking away with the same measured pace he had approached. Marcus stood there for a moment longer. The conversation lingered, not as words but as weight. Suspicion. Recognition. Something unresolved. Out beyond the harbor, the ocean stretched wide and indifferent. Somewhere out there, a boat had once moved forward without turning back. No storm, no accident, just a man, making a decision. Marcus looked toward the horizon, and for the first time the question wasn't why did he leave? It was, what did he think he was protecting by doing it? Marcus stayed. Not because he had answers, not because the town had asked him to, and not because anything had changed overnight. He stayed because, for the first time in a long while, leaving felt too familiar. The house hadn't been abandoned in the way people usually meant. It hadn't collapsed. It hadn't rotted through or been reclaimed by weeds. It had simply stopped. The white paint had dulled, not peeled. The porch still held weight, though one of the boards gave a quiet protest if stepped on too hard. The windows were clean enough to see through, but not clean enough to invite light. It was the kind of place that looked like it was waiting for someone to come back and decide what to do with it. Marcus didn't ask for permission. He didn't knock. He used the key Darlene had handed him without ceremony, the metal cool and smooth from years of use. The door opened with a soft resistance, like a breath that had been held too long. Inside, the air was still. Not stale, just untouched. Marcus stepped in slowly, boots quiet against the wooden floor. He didn't switch on the lights right away. He let his eyes adjust to the dimness, to the shapes of furniture that hadn't moved in years. A chair near the window, a table with a single scratch across its surface, a coat hanging on a hook by the door. Everything in its place. Everything paused mid-thought. He didn't explore the house like a stranger. He moved through it like someone trying not to disturb a memory. Opening a window here, clearing dust from a surface there, fixing a loose hinge that had started to sag under its own weight. He didn't change anything. He didn't rearrange. He just kept it from slipping further away. Atlas did not follow him inside at first. The dog remained on the porch, as it always had, its body positioned in that familiar place between the door and the world beyond it. Marcus didn't call for him, didn't gesture, didn't try to bridge the distance. Some things, he understood, couldn't be rushed without breaking them. The first few days passed like that. Work at the harbor in the mornings, the house in the afternoons, silence in the evenings. Marcus didn't think of it as routine. He didn't think of it as anything at all. He just did what was in front of him. It was on the fourth day that something shifted. Not in the house, in Atlas. Marcus had been fixing the loose board on the porch, the one that dipped slightly underweight. He had pried it up carefully, revealing the nails beneath, old, rusted, but still holding. He worked with steady hands, replacing what needed replacing, leaving what could still serve. Atlas stood a few feet away, watching. Not closely, not suspiciously, just present. The wind moved in from the ocean, carrying that familiar mix of salt and something sharper, metal, faint but distinct. Atlas's head turned slightly. Marcus noticed. Not because it was unusual, because it wasn't. The dog had done that before. But this time, it didn't move to the door. It didn't step into position. It just stood there, looking toward the horizon for a moment longer than usual. Then, slowly, it turned back. Not to the door, to Marcus. The shift was small, barely visible, but it was there, a decision made without sound. Marcus didn't react, not outwardly. He kept working, driving the new nail into place with measured strikes of the hammer. But something in his chest tightened. Not in discomfort, but in recognition. That line again, the one from the letter. You deserve someone who doesn't disappear halfway through a promise. He didn't know if Ethan had meant it for the dog, or for himself, or for someone else entirely. But standing there, with the weight of the hammer in his hand, and the dog's gaze no longer fixed on the door, it felt different. You're doing it wrong. The voice came from behind him. Marcus didn't turn right away. He finished the motion he had started, setting the hammer down before shifting his attention. Darlene stood at the edge of the path, hands tucked into the pockets of her cardigan. Her expression was calm, but there was something almost amused in the corners of her mouth. "Which part?" Marcus asked. "The part where you think fixing the house is about the house." Marcus leaned back slightly, resting his weight on his heels. "It's falling apart," he said. Darlene nodded. "Everything does," she replied. "Eventually." A pause. "That's not what I meant." Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, setting it aside. "Then what did you mean?" Darlene stepped a little closer, her gaze moving briefly to Atlas before returning to Marcus. "You're not fixing wood," she said. "You're deciding whether something deserves to keep standing." Marcus glanced at the house, then back at her. "And?" Darlene tilted her head slightly. "And you don't strike me as the kind of man who commits to that lightly." Marcus didn't answer, because he didn't have one. Not yet. Darlene looked at Atlas again. "He's different," she said. Marcus followed her gaze. The dog stood in the same place, but something in its posture had softened. Not weakened, just less rigid. "He's getting older," Marcus said. Darlene shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "He's adjusting." That word stayed with Marcus longer than the conversation. Adjusting. Not waiting, not forgetting, something else. Later that evening, the sky turned the deep, muted gold that only lasted a few minutes before fading into blue. Marcus stood inside the house near the open window, letting the cool air move through the space. He could hear the ocean more clearly from here. Not louder, just closer. Behind him, the door remained open. He hadn't closed it, didn't feel the need to. Atlas stepped inside. It wasn't dramatic. There was no hesitation that stretched into meaning. No moment of tension or decision that demanded attention. The dog simply crossed the threshold, its paws quiet against the wood, and moved a few steps into the room. Marcus didn't turn immediately. He let the sound settle. Then slowly, he looked back. Atlas stood near the center of the room, not exploring, not searching. Just standing, the same way it had stood outside. But here, inside, the space changed around it. Or maybe it changed because of it. Marcus didn't move toward him, didn't speak. He just stayed where he was. And after a moment, Atlas lowered itself to the floor, not near the door, not near Marcus, somewhere in between. The space held, not empty, not full, just shared. Marcus leaned his shoulder lightly against the wall, arms crossing loosely. He didn't smile, didn't relax completely. But something in him, something that had been held tight for longer than he could measure, shifted, just enough to make room for something else. Outside, the wind moved again, carrying the distant sound of waves breaking against the shore. Inside, the house no longer felt like it was waiting. It felt like it had been given permission to exist again. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Not to rest, just to feel the moment settle. There were still questions. Still things he didn't understand. Still pieces that didn't fit. But for once, he didn't feel the need to solve them. Some things didn't need to be explained. They just needed to be continued. The wind came in earlier that evening. Not stronger, just sooner. Marcus noticed it without looking. There was a way the house held sound now, different from when he had first stepped inside. The walls no longer swallowed the outside world entirely. They carried it, let it move through, settle, fade. The ocean had a rhythm to it, and the house had begun to learn it again. He stood in the kitchen, one hand resting on the edge of the counter, watching the last of the light stretch thin across the floorboards. It was the kind of light that didn't stay long enough to belong to anything. Just pass through. Like most things. Atlas had been inside for most of the day, not following Marcus, not keeping distance, just occupying space. There was a difference now, not closeness, not familiarity, but an absence of resistance. The dog no longer positioned himself at the edge of leaving. He simply stayed where he was, until the wind changed. It always came with the wind, that faint trace, salt, iron, something deeper that didn't belong to the surface. Marcus didn't know what it was, he only knew what it did. Atlas stood, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with certainty. His body shifted in one smooth motion, head lifting slightly, ears adjusting, not sharply, but enough. He moved toward the door. Marcus watched him go, didn't move, didn't speak. The distance between them was small, a few steps, a threshold, a habit. Atlas stopped in front of the door, the same place, the same angle, the same stillness that had once defined him. Marcus's fingers curled slightly against the counter, not tight, not tense, just aware. He knew what came next. He had seen it, understood it, accepted it. The dog would wait, the door would open, the night would take its place, and everything would continue as it always had. That was the pattern. Marcus pushed away from the counter, walked toward the door. Each step quiet, measured, not hesitant, not rushed. Atlas didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him. He didn't need to. Marcus stopped beside him, looked at the door, at the handle, at the thin line of space beneath it where air moved freely between inside and out. His hand hovered, not touching, just there. For a moment, the past pressed in, not as memory but as instinct. Open the door, let it happen. Don't interfere with what already knows how to exist. That was the easier path, it always had been. Marcus lowered his hand. The decision wasn't loud, didn't arrive with clarity or certainty. It came the way most things did for him. Quietly, without permission. I'm not opening it, he said. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. Atlas shifted. just slightly. His head turned a fraction, not enough to fully look at Marcus, but enough to acknowledge something had changed. The silence stretched. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Marcus moved. Not toward the door, down. He sat on the floor, back resting against the wood, legs stretched out slightly in front of him. The position wasn't deliberate. It was simply where his body settled. For a long moment, nothing happened. Atlas remained standing, still facing the door, still holding that position as if the act itself carried meaning beyond motion. Then he moved. Not toward Marcus, not away, around, a slow circle, measured, each step placed with quiet precision, as if he were mapping something unseen. He stopped, sat, stood again, turned once more. It wasn't agitation, it wasn't confusion, it was something deeper, the body remembering, the mind reconsidering. Marcus didn't reach out, didn't speak again. He let the space exist, let the dog move through whatever it needed to. Time passed. He didn't track it, didn't need to. The light faded completely. The room settled into shadow, broken only by the faint glow from the window and the thin line beneath the door. Atlas stood again. Closer now, not at the door, not quite with Marcus. Somewhere between. His breathing was steady, not heavy, not strained, but different. Like something inside him had shifted just enough to be noticed. Marcus rested his head lightly against the door behind him. The wood was cool, solid, unmoving. He lifted his hand, slowly, carefully, and placed it against Atlas's back. No command, no expectation, just contact. The fur beneath his palm was thicker than it looked, coarse in places, softer beneath, warm, alive, present. Atlas didn't pull away, didn't lean in. He simply allowed it. The moment held. Not fragile, not tense, just real. Outside, the wind moved again. Carried the distant sound of waves, a boat engine somewhere far off, faint enough to be mistaken for memory. Atlas's ear twitched, his head shifted slightly toward the door, and then nothing. He didn't move forward, didn't step into position. Didn't return to the place he had held for years. He stood, breathing, thinking, if thinking was the right word. Marcus didn't tighten his hand, didn't hold him there. He kept it where it was, steady, unmoving. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Then, slowly, so slowly it might have been missed if anyone had been watching for something dramatic. Atlas lowered himself to the floor. Not in front of the door, beside Marcus. His body stretched out along the floorboards, one paw extended slightly forward, head resting low but not fully relaxed. Marcus exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He didn't look down, didn't shift. He stayed where he was, hand still resting lightly against the dog's back. The door remained closed. Outside, the night continued, unchanged, unconcerned. Inside, something had ended. Or perhaps something had been released. Atlas didn't sleep. Not fully. His breathing stayed steady, his ears adjusting slightly to the sounds beyond the walls. But he didn't rise, didn't return to the door. Marcus stayed there with him. Not because he had to, not because he was waiting for something. Because leaving in that moment didn't make sense. The hours passed, uncounted, unmeasured. At some point, Marcus closed his eyes. Not to rest, just to let the stillness settle deeper. There were no thoughts, no questions, no need to understand what had happened. Just the quiet weight of presence, shared, unbroken. For the first time in years, the space between the door and the night outside no longer held expectation. And for the first time in just as long, Atlas did not wait. Summer did not arrive all at once. It unfolded the way the tide did, slow, steady, almost unnoticed until something had already changed. The mornings grew softer first. The air held warmth longer before the wind came in from the ocean. By midday, the harbor filled with movement. Boats returning, engines humming, voices layering over one another without urgency. Cannon Beach had always known how to carry time lightly. Marcus began to notice it, not because he was looking for it, but because he had stopped resisting it. He no longer woke before dawn out of habit. Some mornings, the light reached him first. It slipped through the window of the small room above the convenience store, settling quietly across the floor, across the edge of the chair, across his boots resting where he had left them the night before. He didn't rush to get up, didn't measure the day before it began. He let it come to him. At the harbor, Caleb no longer asked if Marcus was staying. The question had dissolved somewhere between shared work and unspoken understanding. Caleb handed him tools without explanation, trusted him with repairs that required more than simple labor. There were moments, small, unremarkable, when Caleb would step back and let Marcus take the lead without saying so. It wasn't permission. It was recognition. "You're settling in," Caleb said one afternoon, wiping his hands on a rag as they stood beside a newly repaired hull. Marcus glanced up. "I'm working," he replied. Caleb gave a short huff of amusement. "That's not the same thing." Marcus didn't argue, because quietly he knew Caleb was right. Across town, Mrs. Darlene Whitaker had begun leaving her front door open more often. Not wide, just enough. The lace curtains shifted gently with the breeze, and sometimes, when Marcus passed by, he would catch the faint sound of music drifting out from inside. Old records, the kind that carried more memory than melody. She smiled more now, not broadly, but enough that the lines on her face softened instead of deepened. One evening, as Marcus stepped off the porch of Ethan's house, Darlene called out to him. "You've changed the place," she said. Marcus looked back at the house. The paint was still worn. The boards still creaked. The furniture inside remained where it had always been. "I didn't change anything," he said. Darlene tilted her head slightly. "No," she replied. "You just stopped it from disappearing." That was the closest she came to approval. Sheriff Nolan Pierce no longer lingered near the harbor when Marcus was there. The watchfulness hadn't disappeared entirely. It had simply shifted. Less pointed, less immediate. More like something filed away rather than actively pursued. One afternoon, their paths crossed near the edge of town. Nolan stopped. Marcus did the same. For a moment neither spoke, then Nolan nodded once. Not friendly, not unfriendly, just acknowledgement. Marcus returned it. Nothing more was needed. Atlas moved differently now. Not slower in the way age demanded, but quieter in intention. The sharp edges of his movements had softened, as if the constant tension he had carried for years had finally loosened its hold. He still rose when Marcus moved, still followed when the door opened, but not out of habit, not out of expectation. It was early morning when Marcus decided to go to the beach. The sky hadn't fully brightened yet. The horizon held that pale line between night and day where everything seemed possible for a brief moment before settling into certainty. Atlas walked beside him. Not ahead, not behind. The sand was cool beneath their feet. The tide was low, pulling the water back just enough to expose long stretches of damp shoreline that reflected the sky like a broken mirror. They walked without speaking. There was nothing to say. When they reached the edge where the waves met the sand, Marcus stopped. Atlas did the same. The ocean stretched out before them. Wide, endless, indifferent. Somewhere out there, A boat had once moved forward without turning back. No storm, no accident, just a decision. Marcus let out a slow breath. The air tasted of salt, clean, uncomplicated. "He's not coming back," Marcus said. The words didn't feel heavy. They didn't carry accusation or regret. They simply existed. Atlas didn't react. He didn't need to. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, looking out toward the horizon. For a moment he tried to imagine it. Ethan, standing on that boat, the shoreline shrinking behind him, the open water stretching ahead. What had he felt? Relief? Fear? Freedom? Or just silence? Marcus shook his head slightly. It didn't matter, not anymore. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. The words came easier this time, not forced, not tested, just true. The wind moved across the water, lifting the surface in small, restless patterns. Atlas stepped forward, just one pace, then sat, not facing the horizon, facing slightly toward Marcus. It was a small shift, easy to miss, but it carried something quiet within it. Not dependence, not expectation, presence. Marcus let his gaze drop for a moment, watching the dog settle into the sand. There were more gray strands in his coat now than before. The sharp lines of his body had softened, not with weakness but with time. He wasn't the dog who had stood at the door for years, not anymore. Neither of them were. Marcus sat down beside him. The sand gave slightly beneath his weight, cool and grounding. He rested his forearms on his knees, hands loose, gaze drifting between the water and the horizon without settling on either. For a long time they stayed like that, not waiting, not searching, just there. Behind them, the town had begun to wake. Distant voices carried faintly through the air, the low hum of a truck engine, the creak of a door opening somewhere along the line of houses. Life continuing, without pause, without permission. Marcus didn't turn. He didn't need to see it. He could feel it. For years, he had lived as if everything was temporary. Every place, every connection, every moment, something to pass through, something not meant to hold. But sitting there, with the ocean stretching endlessly in front of him and the quiet weight of Atlas beside him, that idea felt distant, unnecessary. He didn't need to understand what Ethan had done, didn't need to justify it, didn't need to carry it. Some people left. That was part of the world. But not everything they left behind needed to be followed. Some things needed to be held, maintained, continued. Marcus exhaled slowly. The tension that had once defined him, tight, constant, unyielding, had eased into something else. Not peace, not entirely, but something close enough that he no longer felt the need to question it. Atlas shifted slightly beside him, adjusting his position in the sand, then stilled again. The tide began to turn. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. The water crept forward, reclaiming the space it had given up. Marcus watched it for a moment, then leaned back slightly, resting his hands behind him in the sand. He didn't think about leaving, not once. The horizon remained what it had always been. Distant, unreachable, unchanged. But for the first time, it didn't feel like something pulling him away. It was just there. Some people don't come back, and some questions are never meant to be answered, but that doesn't mean everything they left behind is meant to be lost. Sometimes the quiet miracle is this: not finding what's gone, but choosing to stay with what remains, to care for it, to keep it alive, to not walk away again. Maybe in your own life, there's something or someone you've been ready to leave behind too quickly. Maybe this is your moment to stay. If this story meant something to you, share where you're watching from or leave a thought in the comments. And if you believe in stories that heal quietly, consider subscribing to keep them alive. May you find the strength to stay where it matters, and the peace to let go where it doesn't.